Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Avik, the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and it's so great to be here with you today with Paul Mango. Paul Mango was, and I'm trying to remember, Paul, your exact title. You were, was it Deputy Chief of Staff to the HHS Secretary? Paul,
Yeah, that's correct, Avik. I was Deputy Chief of Staff for policy, but didn't work much on policy during 2020, obviously.
And before that, you were working at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services as the Chief of Staff over there. Is that right?
That's correct. From 2018 to 19, I was there. And then 2019 to 21, I was up at the department with Secretary Azar.
Thanks for that. And so Paul has a remarkable background, and we'll get into some of that today. A guy who went to West Point, graduate of West Point, graduate of Harvard Business School, spent 25 years at McKinsey, ran unsuccessfully for governor of Pennsylvania after his time at McKinsey, and found himself pulled back into public policy through his relationships in the healthcare world. And he's written a really, I think, the definitive account of Operation Warp Speed, the effort between the federal government and the private sector to develop COVID vaccines. There's a lot to talk about with this book. We're going to try to do our best to get through all the interesting dimensions of vaccines. And for those of you who are watching, I want to encourage you to pipe in, whether it's in the chat or the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, put it in the Q&A section, not the chat, because I can't look at everything at the same time and ask questions to Paul. But we're gonna monitor everything and make sure that we get to your questions pretty much as soon as you start piping in with them. So don't feel like you have to wait until half an hour in or 45 minutes in to come in with your questions. So you've got questions right away, go ahead and send them in, and we'll try to get to your questions as soon as they start popping up after we get through some introductory remarks. So Paul, you wrote this book. I think, to me, the number one thing I take away from your book is that this was far from inevitable. I think there's a tendency in the coverage of the Operation Warp Speed to say, oh, well, there was all this innovation and the government just kind of worked them and it all just kind of happened. And, any administration, any group of individuals who were working on this would have achieved the same endpoint, the same success. And I read your book as you guys dealt with incredible logistical hurdles, incredible coordination. There were so many challenges. To talk about that, like, is that a correct impression for me to get from the book?
It's a great interpretation, Avik, and I just want to thank you again for having me today, because I think it's part of what we're trying to do, which is to tell the true story of Operation Warp Speed. But to get to your question, the scientific aspect of this was actually quite straightforward. And Monsef Slaoui, who was the chief scientific advisor, told us in April, he said, listen, we're going to have a good vaccine. What I'm really worried about is the manufacturing and the logistics. And that's difficult enough when you're not in the middle of a global pandemic. But when you're struggling to get, for instance, 50% of the raw materials to manufacture vaccines came from overseas. A lot of the specialized equipment in which those are produced came from overseas. You had, I'll just give you an example, Catalent, which is one of the manufacturers in Indianapolis, had to go from about 800 to 4,000 employees in 6 months during a time when a lot of folks were staying at home because they were, because of COVID concerns or because of isolation. And you couldn't just pick up any employee off the street and make them a vaccine producer. You had to actually train them and so forth. So as you articulated, the logistical aspect of this in terms of raw materials, equipment, labor was actually the most challenging part. And as Monsef would say, manufacturing vaccines, he said, they're very temperamental. They're like biological organisms that have their own way of doing things. And you never know until the end whether or not you have a good vaccine or not from a manufacturing perspective. So absolutely, those were the difficult parts.
Do you think that, one of the things that you talk about in the book is the partnership, the runaway, the trust you had with, whether it's the vaccine manufacturers, whether it's the pharmacies like CVS and Walgreens that were delivering the vaccine to patients. How much of that do you think is standard operating procedure in terms of working with the private sector, and how much of it was something that was unusual, where you felt like the degree of trust and collaboration was much higher than it might have been with another administration?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we were in the midst of a national emergency, and I think that had an impact on the level of cooperation we were having across the board. And I'll get to the private sector in a moment, but the most important aspect of the trust was really the core members of the Operation Warp Speed team and the trust they had in each other. These are folks who had never met each other. Gus Perna had never met Monsef Slaoui prior to Operation Warp Speed, yet very quickly there was a level of trust amongst all of the key leaders that was absolutely key to our success. As you know, you just can't get things done as effectively and as quickly on a team if you don't have that level of trust. But the private sector, and the book is really a tribute to America's private sector. It truly is. The government, as I write in the book, enabled the success. The private sector delivered it. And some of the things that occurred were just extraordinary in terms of the 7-day-a-week effort that, for instance, the Palantir software engineers were side by side with us 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, never complained once. You had CVS, I remember this, Gus Perna went out to kind of trust but verify. He went out to visit them and see what their plan was going to be to vaccinate 1.5 million seniors who were in nursing homes, which was our highest priority. He came back, he said, Paul, I've been in the Army for 40 years. I've never seen a more detailed operating plan than what CVS has to do this. It just gives you a sense for the level of effort. The CEOs of these companies were deeply involved. They were at our fingertips in terms of our cell phones, we could call them. So well beyond, I'm sure, any profit motive that they might have had, they really made a commitment to this country. And I think the Americans are the beneficiaries of that.
So tell us a little bit about the backstory of how this all came about. So obviously COVID's raging. You all think right away about the possibility of developing a vaccine. What led you to believe that it could be done so quickly?
Yeah, so as I talk about in the book, our notification of the COVID virus came on January 3rd of 2020. We were 1 or 2 days back from our Christmas vacations, quite honestly. So it was a little bit of a shock. And the government has a format where it activates what's called a disaster leadership group when something like this occurs. And Bob Kadlec, who was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, led that group, and it was activated in January, right after we learned about this. And one of its roles is to think through what they call medical countermeasures, vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. So that process began. And in fact, Peter Marks down at the FDA in late February, early March, scanned the whole globe for vaccine candidates and found there were about 95 at the time. So this work was going on. But the catalyst for Operation Warp Speed was the call we got from the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. This was in late March, sitting in the secretary's office, and someone hands me a note saying Alex Gorski, who is the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, would like to talk to the secretary. I knew Alex because we were both at West Point together, somewhat ironically. And he gets on the phone. He said, hey, Mr. Secretary, I just want to thank you for the $450 million grant you gave us today. And Azar puts the phone on mute and turns to me, asking me if I know anything about it, and I didn't. He gets back on the phone and thanks Alex Gorski, and then hangs up and says, let's get the BARDA folks in here. So we got the BARDA's the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority within HHS, which is the one that delivered this grant to Johnson & Johnson. And we asked them, and Secretary Azar, with 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry, knew this, and he asked them, what did we get for our $450 million? And the answer was Johnson & Johnson will start its phase 1 human clinical trial in September. And Azar right away said, well, that sounds like business as usual. And the BARDA folks didn't have a good answer to that. So they were dismissed. And he turned to me and said, we have to change business as usual. There's 2 or 3 things we absolutely need to do differently. And one of them, which was one of the keys to our success, was we need to start manufacturing these vaccines now if we're ever going to have a reasonable number of them as soon as possible. And by the way, the federal government's going to have to assume the financial risk for that, because pharmaceutical companies won't do that on their own. That's kind of how it started. We didn't know at that time we were going to have a good vaccine, but when we started interviewing folks like Monsef Slaoui and Carlo Di Natale Stefani, who's the manufacturing expert, and then of course we got Gus Perna and had the core team together, they laid out a process that gave us a tremendous amount of confidence. And if you remember, Monsef came from Moderna. He was a board member at Moderna. He left that position to join the government, by the way, worked for $1. That's what he made out of this. We had to pay him $1, the contractors told us. And Monsef said, we're going to have a good vaccine. He had already seen a good vaccine because he left the Moderna board in April. They already had a good vaccine by that time. And again, he said, I think our biggest challenge is going to be manufacturing. So that's where we put a lot of effort. And by about August, September, we did you saw this in the book, Avik. It was called the cumulative probability analysis, because we had more information about manufacturability and some of the early trial results. And at the end of August, we had about a 75% probability that we'd have at least one safe and effective vaccine manufactured at scale, effective in those over age 65 before year end. So we had a lot of confidence from the late summer on that we were going to be able to do this.
And one of the things that was interesting at that point is that you had a couple of interesting things in your strategy that again were not inevitable. First, you roped in people like Gus Perna, who, as military people, were very, very good at logistics. One thing the U.S. Armed Forces are very, very good at, and we're seeing it now in the Russia-Ukraine war, the importance of logistics. And the U.S. military is extremely, extremely sophisticated about logistics, and that seemed to me a very interesting choice that not everyone would have made. And then the next thing you did that was interesting was you bet on a lot of different types of vaccine technologies, and this was Monsef's leadership in particular, at least from what I could see. And what's interesting is that was not a universally held view. You in the book you talk about Deborah Birx as someone who did not believe that the government should be investing in a wide range of vaccine technologies like Moderna. She felt that the specific protein subunit vaccines that were more traditional in orientation, that was where the government should have its focus. Tell us a little bit about that debate, because that debate seems to me like it was pretty important, pretty consequential, because you guys made the right decision there. Didn't necessarily have to turn out that way. If the government had only invested in the subunit vaccines, we'd be in a very different place right now.
You're exactly right, Avik, because neither of the two protein subunit vaccines, which was GSK, Sanofi, and Novavax, has been approved yet. So we're already into 2022. But it was very interesting because Monsef Slaoui, people maybe had never heard of him prior to Operation Warp Speed. Some still don't know his name, but he's the most successful vaccine developer of our generation. 14 successful vaccines he put into the market over 30 years of a career. So he knew what he was talking about. And more than a scientist, he's a strategist, which is what you were basically implying. And what he knew was that there was a lot of variables in this formula of which vaccine might be effective, which one was most manufacturable, which manufacturers could get their hands on raw materials and that type of thing. So he took a very venture capital mindset to this, and he chose 3 different technology platforms, obviously mRNA, and then viral vector and protein subunit, and 2 different manufacturers in each one. And interestingly, we got a lot of advice from the outside, as you can imagine, over the months. And a lot of that advice was, why don't you have 12 candidates instead of 6? Don't you have a higher probability of success? Actually not true. And this is where Gus Perna was so crucial to our success, because what he knew is the logistics of supporting 12 candidates and the complexity of getting those to market. So I talk in the book about obviously, these vaccines have to be stored and transported at different temperatures. They have different intervals between the first and second shot. They take different size needles, different types of syringes. So if you kept on adding to the number of vaccine candidates, sure, scientifically, we might have had a higher probability of having at least one good one, but logistically, the complexity would have just overwhelmed us. And just think about clinical trials. The FDA put out a standard in June of 2020 that said you have to have a minimum of 30,000 persons going through your phase 3 clinical trial. Well, if we had 12 candidates vying for the same subjects for the clinical trials, it would have strained the clinical trials and obviously taken a lot longer time. So it was the combination of Monsef's kind of strategic thinking in terms of 3 different platforms and Gus's discipline to say, hey, we can't go too far beyond 6 because we're going to have logistical complexities. And Dr. Birx, who's a brilliant woman and a hard-working woman, was taking her experience from AIDS in Africa and saying, I think this would be a better vaccine. But COVID in America was not AIDS in Africa, and it wasn't during a global pandemic that you had to fight for these raw materials and equipment and subjects for the trial participants. So fortunately, Monsef and Gus won that argument, and we are where we are. But it was just a good scientific debate, if you will. It got heated a few times, but I think it was all in good faith.
One of the things that's interesting is, the Pfizer vaccine, or the so-called Pfizer vaccine, the BioNTech vaccine, is developed in Germany and then marketed in the US and further developed by Pfizer. That was one that didn't participate in Operation Warp Speed. And as a result, at least the way I read it in your book, they basically didn't end up being able to deliver the vaccines that they said they would early on. And they eventually obviously got to market, but in those early months when it was really important to get the vaccine to as many people as possible, they actually had a tough time delivering in the way that Moderna and others have delivered.
Yeah, and I always start by saying I think Pfizer has delivered just tremendous value to the American people during this pandemic. So I don't want to take that away from them, but they were extraordinarily difficult to work with. And the way I really describe it is they wanted all the benefits of Operation Warp Speed without some of the obligations associated with it. So they actually did participate where they felt they could benefit from it, like an advance purchase contract for a couple $2 billion. We secured all their needles and syringes and dry ice. We gave them a Title III Priority Defense Production Act, for the raw materials. But what they didn't want was something Carlo de Notari Stefani had with all the other manufacturers, which was a multidisciplinary government team out in the factories. Literally, we deployed persons out in the factories so that we could identify as quickly as possible any complications they had with manufacturing. And if you remember what we talked about a couple of minutes ago, manufacturing is what we were most worried about and most nervous about. So Pfizer didn't want anyone in its Kalamazoo plant. And okay, fine. We'll trust you to get it done. But come November and December, when they promised us 20 million doses in each month, we find out in early December, we're not going to get them. And we only wound up getting 18 million, so less than 50% of what they said. Now, we understand there are manufacturing issues, but when you know that and then you don't want the help, that's why it became a bit awkward with them. And unfortunately for General Perna, he was making commitments to the governors. You can imagine, we were only a couple of weeks away from distributing vaccines. The governors wanted to know legitimately, how many are we going to get the first week? How many are we going to get the second week? And Gus was putting out numbers that turned out not to be true. And it hurt the team's credibility because Pfizer was not being completely transparent with us.
Yeah, that's an important piece of information that is not widely known, right? When the vaccines were launched, there was a lot of complaining about why there weren't more vaccines in those early couple of months. And this was the key episode that threw everything asunder.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Moderna, for instance, which accepted our help, embraced our help, had twice the number of vaccines available when it was granted its EUA, which was only a week after Pfizer. But they took full advantage in a positive way of the government's support, and it was a much better outcome for them and for the American people.
We have a couple of questions. One is about the FDA approval process, and before I get to the question, let's talk about that, because that sort of second half of 2020, there was a lot of controversy around what the FDA was doing or not doing when it comes to vaccine approval. There were, Andrew Cuomo and Kamala Harris were saying that there was a conspiracy in which the FDA was going to approve the vaccines before all the data was in, and that you shouldn't take the vaccine if it's approved before the election. On the flip side, there was a lot of frustration from people in the White House that the FDA was delaying the approval of the vaccine until after the election, because they didn't want to in any way be seen as helping the president. Tell us what was really going on there. What was going on at the FDA? And at the end of the day, I mean, we had a lot of data to suggest these vaccines worked. This was not like a cholesterol drug. This was a public health emergency. Why did it take so long once the data was in the FDA's hands for these things to get approved?
Yeah, so actually the duration of time from the time they got the data to the time they granted the emergency use authorizations was 14 days. And that's a world record for the FDA. So what Peter Marks did, who's just really a spectacular character in this whole story, Peter Marks, who oversees the Center for Biological Evaluation and Research at the FDA, that's the agency that approves these vaccines, he reorganized his department to work 7 days a week, 3 shifts. So instead of taking what would normally be months to approve or grant an EUA, in this case, he promised us in the summer of 2020, if I have good data, I'll get you an answer in 14 days. And that sounds like a long time, but it truly is a record for the FDA. In June of 2020, Peter and his team, in conjunction with Francis Collins and the NIH, put out standards for what the EUA evaluation would comprise. And he did that, and that's where the 30,000 came from, for instance, the minimum of 30,000 persons in the phase 3 clinical trial. It was part of our success because he made it unambiguous as to what the standards would be for EUA evaluation and approval. And of course, the manufacturers liked that because then they could structure their clinical trials accordingly. The controversy began in the early fall. So the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, came out in September, late September, and said, our internal models suggest we're going to have great data. And not only that, we're going to have it before the end of October. Some could translate that into before the election, which was November 3rd. About a week and a half after that, October 6th, Peter Marks put out a revised guidance from the FDA. And the revision was a very, not very well known characteristic, which is of a clinical trial, which is 42 days after an inoculation is when the vast majority of adverse reactions take place in any individual. And it's like at the 95% confidence level. Peter Marks took that 42 days in October after Albert Bourla made his announcement and extended it to 60 days. So he said, listen, we need to see 60-day interval after the second shot is administered to the median participant in your trial, i.e. the 20,000th person. And so that was on I think the front page of the New York Times and a few other things. It became controversial. So I did go back last summer when I was writing the book, and I spent a lot of time with Peter Marks, and he had a very good explanation for it. He said, Paul, we were very worried about vaccine hesitancy, and we thought that imposing this stricter standard would have a positive impact on the American people, understanding that we were particularly careful about this, even in a time of emergency. And I said, I think Peter's a great individual, highly ethical, so I believed him. But I'm like, Peter, I don't know. I don't think most Americans would kind of process the fact that 42 to 60 days in the middle of a clinical trial, that's kind of an obscure aspect of safety, right? So that's where the controversy was. And of course, Pfizer announced its data 6 days after the election. So you could say, okay, 18 days, they had to wait longer, 6 days after the election. So you can imagine the controversy that stimulated. But in the book, I do talk about Peter Marks, I think, being truly an honorable gentleman and really a crucial player in our success.
Well, we did a webinar just like this with Alex Azar, HHS secretary, when he was leaving office, kind of an exit interview for him. And I asked him this question of, now I understand that the first time around with these COVID vaccines, there was a lot of, particularly because the mRNA technology was so new, in order to generate confidence that these vaccines really worked, it was important to do larger studies. It's a shame because really we knew these things worked technologically much earlier on. We could have saved a lot of lives if we had launched them earlier, but that would have been controversial for some of the reasons you mentioned and many others. So you understand that you're going to have to do big phase 2, if not phase 3 trials the first time around with mRNA vaccines. But now that we know that they work, shouldn't we be able to, in a public health emergency, launch these vaccines at an earlier stage of development, since the chassis or the cassette that the vaccine is functioning in is basically identical, and all you're changing is the genetic sequence that the mRNA vaccine is coding for? Doesn't that, on a technical level, mean that we should be able to, run these things out pretty quickly after new variants come in or new viral threats come in the future?
Well, as you know, the FDA has 2 standards for approval. One is what you just described. Is it effective? Of course, the other one is it safe? And I think you're precisely correct when you talk about the mRNA technology and our ability to determine its effectiveness. I'm not sure whether we're there yet on the safety dimension. As you know, there's a few things emerging about myocarditis and blood clots. I guess blood clots is more the J&J vaccine, but even with the mRNA vaccines, people are identifying a few issues that are concerning to them. Now, the standard for emergency use authorization approval is, given the full weight of the scientific evidence, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And indeed, for vast majority of the population in America, that was a true statement. And, in some healthy Stanford varsity athlete, maybe that's not the case, but in most persons, it's the case. So I think folks would just want to look a little bit more at the safety profile. And to your point, very interestingly, I talk about this briefly in the book, and the question arose about a human challenge study, which would have accelerated the release of these vaccines. A human challenge study is basically you intentionally infect individuals with the virus to determine whether or not the vaccine would work. You don't go through a normal clinical trial. You intentionally infect persons with the virus. And we debated this. And we decided not to do it because what Monsef said was, on an ethical basis, he said, in order for us to test these vaccines, we'd have to insert that virus deep into the lungs of people who are highly vulnerable to the virus, meaning seniors and people with underlying health conditions. They will die for sure. We know that much about the virus. And he said, for that reason, we should go through this in a normal process and not go through a human challenge study. His second reasoning was, there'll be hundreds of millions of persons getting these vaccines. It's not like a therapeutic where you're laying in the hospital and you're sick, and this may or may not help you. You can take more risks when that's the case. But if there's hundreds of millions of individuals getting this, and the case fatality rate for COVID is turning out to be about 0.3, the equation of safety versus effectiveness is very important. And we kind of went in the direction of safety, and that's why we didn't do the human challenge study. But all of these were debated, considered by true experts and very ethical individuals. I think we came out at the right place.
As you allude to, the safety and the efficacy, the confidence that the public has in these vaccines has been a subject of robust debate, controversy, even more, you could say, if you think about the Canadian truckers and all that. What should people know about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines? And do you feel like you could have done anything differently to increase confidence in the vaccines?
Yeah, a great question. And I think this is the one area where, if we could do it over again, we would have done it differently. I think we dropped the ball on the basic communications about this. And the fine line we were walking, as you can imagine, is if we had come out in the fall before any EUA was granted, before the FDA ever got any data, and said, don't worry, America, we're going to have safe and effective vaccines for you. They're coming, they're coming. We would have been appropriately accused of unduly influencing the FDA. They need to be 100% objective. They are the world's gold standard for safety and effectiveness. In fact, they did not approve the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is pretty pervasive in other countries around the world, but not here in America. And they made the right decision on that. So we didn't want to be accused of that. So we had to be very, very careful about what we were saying about the emerging vaccines and their safety profiles. But what we could have done is what I described a little bit earlier, is to say, listen, American people, we don't know whether these are going to be safe and effective, but here's what we do know. And what we do know is we're going to apply higher standards to these vaccines than any vaccine that's ever undergone FDA evaluation. And that's 30,000 persons in the trial instead of 20. It's the 60 days instead of the 42 days that we talked about. We could have done that and therefore not at all influenced the FDA unduly, but given the American people more confidence. But that's a 2020 hindsight issue. I wish we had done it. We were in an intense political environment, as you know, and you mentioned, you know, the president-elect, or not elect at the time, the candidate Biden, candidate Harris, were disparaging the vaccines, and other experts were disparaging the vaccines. And so we could have handled that differently.
I mean, you know, you mentioned that, you know, there were tens of thousands of patients. This was a pretty well-studied vaccine. The data was, I would say, pretty robust as someone who used to analyze clinical trials for a living. And yet you heard a lot of people, my friends, people I talked to saying, you know, I'm not going to take this vaccine. It's an experimental vaccine because it got an emergency use authorization, not a normal FDA approval. It's an experimental vaccine. And even though, you know, tens of thousands of people got it, which is way more than normally in a normal vaccine approval that you would have that level of data, but yet there was this conviction people had that it was unsafe. And the other thing that I'm struck by is, you know, there were criticism of the vaccine that were proven, that were validated relative to the hype, which is to say that the vaccines did not completely prevent transmission. Obviously, we still have COVID running around in various variants, even though a reasonably high percentage of the population has been vaccinated. What do you make of all that? I mean, did we overpromise in terms of what the vaccine could deliver, or do you think that, broadly speaking, it's been the other way around, that the perception of the vaccines is below what it should be given their effectiveness and their safety?
Yeah, I think it's the perception, and I think it's, again, an error we made in communications, because the primary endpoint of the phase 3 clinical trial was not that it prevent infection. It was did it prevent symptomatic and serious illness and or death. Right. So we never communicated that effectively to the American people, and we should have, because once there were some breakthrough infections, people were saying, wait a minute, don't these vaccines work? Well, my response was, did you wind up in the hospital or did you die? No. Well, then therefore they worked, right? So, and I'm being a little bit flippant, but, you know, I looked at some of the recent statistics, and in the Omicron outbreak, the numbers were still 75% or 75% of the folks who, 25% of the folks who died were previously vaccinated. 75% were not previously vaccinated. So, and they attribute that to two things. One is the 95% effectiveness automatically means 5% of people won't be protected by this. And by that time, you're talking about tens of millions of persons who got the shot, who really weren't protected because of the 5%. But second, the waning immunity after, you know, for some persons was 8 or 10 months. And it just wasn't enough, particularly in those who are elderly. It wasn't enough to protect them if they didn't have the booster. Very, very few persons who had the booster died during Omicron. But if you just had the regular vaccine, then it was some of the protection was waning by then.
Do you expect that it's going to be like influenza where people are going to have to get a COVID shot every year based on what variants are floating around, or is this something where over time we'll move on from vaccination?
I think
COVID?
it's the former. I'm not the scientist. I'm not the epidemiologist, but I know there's vaccines being developed right now where you get one injection. It'll be the annual flu and COVID, which is probably a good way of doing it. So you don't have to ask people to get two different shots. And at least for the foreseeable future, what is that? I don't know. The next 5 or 10 years, we'll probably need something like that, and maybe COVID-19 will become history sometime thereafter. But I don't. It's not going to be in the next 12 months or 24 months. I doubt that.
What would you say, aside from, you mentioned the point about the communication around the vaccines is something you would have done differently. What else? What are your biggest lessons learned from this whole experience? You were in the room, you were part of the various task forces. You watched all this play out in real time in the administration. What do you feel like we need to do better next time and can do better the next time we have a serious pandemic? Hopefully we don't have one this bad in the future, but if we were to, for any reason, whether it's naturally occurring or through a military situation.
Yeah, and a lot of what I talk about, if we could do it over again, actually is related to the communications challenge, but it was a little bit different than what we've talked about thus far. One is, I mentioned that, and I was part of a group called the Center for Health, Incentive, and Behavioral Economics at Penn for many years. There's a great scientist there named Dr. Kevin Volpe. And during COVID, what I recognized was we had great epidemiologists and great virologists on the coronavirus task force. You had, as I said, Deb Burks, Bob Redfield, one of the most renowned virologists in the world, Tony Fauci, others. We didn't have a single behavioral scientist on the team. And if you think about the challenge of COVID to America in a free society like this, it's really about behavior modification. Do you get vaccinated? Do you wear your mask? Do you isolate? Do you socially distance? Every one of those is a behavioral characteristic. But we did not have any behavioral science expertise on the team. And I think we would have communicated things differently, use different change levers. We talk about, direct, indirect, and contextual. Direct would be a ban. Indirect would be some form of incentive. We'll give you $50 to come in and get your vaccine. And contextual is what you might be a little bit younger than me, but when I was in elementary school, they wheeled in the formaldehyde clad lung that had black tar all in it and said, if you smoke, this is what your lung is going to look like. Well, I remember that from 60 years ago, right? We didn't do any of that type of communicating with COVID. And I think if we had the right behavioral scientists, we would have done it. Second, I talk in the book about really quite pathetic social media presence that the federal government has. So when I got to CMS, we talked about, I was the chief of staff there for a year. I just come off my campaign, and I recognized we were sending out little booklets to every Medicare beneficiary every year, 60 million of them, costs the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, right? I said, don't we have a means to communicate with all these folks electronically or whatever? What's our social media presence? And Facebook, of course, which is the preferred social media platform for seniors. I said, well, how many followers do we have? CMS as an organization. On Facebook, they said 400,000 out of 60 million. So that just gives you a sense for really the lack of social media presence. And it's a bilateral lack, meaning we can't communicate effectively through that channel, nor do we listen and to the chatter of what's happening. So I think the next time around, that is the easiest source of understanding what is people are talking about out there, which the federal government didn't have that capability, nor did we have the capability to communicate effectively through social media to get information out quickly and consistently. So that was the second one. And then beyond communications, the thing I talk about most in the book is we had zero excess vaccine manufacturing capacity in the United States in the spring of 2020. We had to scramble to either expand or start from scratch 27 different manufacturing facilities. And it's not just the vaccine bulk, it's the fill finish, it's the vials and other things that needed to be manufactured in a hurry, we need to take a close look at that, because I don't want to say we got lucky, because Carlo de Natale Stefani is the leading vaccine manufacturing expert in the world today, but it could have been a lot worse. And I think we need to address that. So those are 2 or 3 things I think, hopefully, that will be better in if we ever experience this type of pandemic.
We got a question from Mark Dorner on our team, who used to work at was it ASME? I always get these acronyms jumbled in my head. But he asks about this anecdote that you mentioned in the beginning about BARDA and the $450 million that they got, that J&J got from BARDA, that you guys didn't know about. I mean, HHS is a big organization, manages $1 trillion, so there's always going to be things that you don't know about. But does it strike you that that's a sign of dysfunction in the agency, or dysfunction in the government in general, that something like that was significant was happening without your awareness?
I think it was well intended, and I think we could look at it 2 different ways. We could look at it as professionals trying to step up and do the right thing in the time of a national emergency, and therefore it's maybe not go through the same decision-making process as you would if it weren't an emergency. But I do think, as you mentioned, the other way of looking at it is we should have had the processes in place to ensure that, those types of resources were not leaving the department without a thorough evaluation of, is this the best way to use it? And most important, what are we getting in return? As I said, what is the deal for the $450 million? So my experience is that career government officials, and my exposure to them, particularly during COVID, was they were spectacular. They wanted to do the right thing. They were experts. And 99% of the time, not only did they act independently in a favorable way, but they did the right thing. So I'd hate to create some sort of bureaucratic process that just dealt with the exception to the rule. And at some level, you have to thank the fact that have to be grateful for the fact that BARDA made this decision, because the light bulb probably wouldn't have gone off in Azar's head until much later if we hadn't had that situation.
If anything, it was, we had a lot of the opposite situations, right? The whole snafu about the CDC and the FDA bogging down the early approaches to testing when people in in universities and private sector were trying to get testing going. So in a sense, you could, make that's a great way to put it. It's almost the contrarian point, which is that at least somebody was doing something that was getting things off the ground. So, one thing you mentioned, and we talked a little bit about how when the Biden administration came in, or was starting to come in, the transition team, they complained that they didn't think that they were claiming that there was no plan to distribute the vaccines. You adamantly disagree and document the fairly sophisticated and elaborate plans you had, and the point about Pfizer not delivering their vaccines. Since you've published the book, or since the book went to press, and that was relatively early in the Biden administration, how would you grade the way the Biden administration has handled vaccination and COVID policy in general since you stopped writing the book?
Yeah. Well, just 2 weeks ago, the White House tweeted out that there were no vaccines available until after President Biden was inaugurated. But then, of course, we had a picture of him getting his vaccine on December 29th. But here's what I would say. First of all, I think the Biden administration did a spectacular job of taking the baton and distributing the vaccines using our plan, by the way. But as I say in the book, I use the football metaphor. They could have fumbled at the goal line, and they didn't. They actually fell into the end zone, which was great. And I mean that. I think they did a very nice job of continuing the effort and distributing. Obviously, by April of 21, anyone who wanted a vaccine could get one, which is great. But the politics of it, they didn't help themselves, right? And people asked me on several occasions, what would you have done if you were Joe Biden? I said, I would have invited Donald Trump to the White House and both kind of champion the vaccines if you want to reduce hesitancy. And what really, I think, upset us about this, and when I say us, I don't mean the political appointees. We knew this was politics when they said that they had to start from scratch. We had no plan. We left them a mess. Those are three quotations. We could take it because we were just political appointees. But what it really did was destroy the morale of the team that was left after we departed. So the vast majority of the Operation Warp Speed team were career officials from the DOD, from the FDA, from the CDC, people working around the clock. And after 8 months of working around the clock, 7 days a week, the new commander in chief comes in and says, or his team says, we had to start from scratch. Well, that didn't help morale for the hundreds of persons who were still there, serving the new administration as they should have been. And I talked to many of the team members afterwards, and that's what they articulated. And in the book, I just say it's a lack of executive presence, right? Because you should have the presence of mind as a senior executive, as the commander in chief, to really motivate your team and not play politics when it comes to something like that. So, I mean, they were trying to lower the bar to make themselves look good. I think they looked fine with how they did on the physical distribution. It's just that they, kind of flubbed I think the messaging, and of course the mandate to get vaccines and a few other things didn't go so well, but they did a great job of distributing them.
We got a question from Tevi Troy, who notes something that you and I were talking about before we went on air, which is that your book is very civil. Your book is not your typical sort of Washington tell-all with lots of dirt dished on everybody who was involved. You certainly have your points of criticism and disagreement that you describe, but it's a much more civil description. And Tevi is noting that a number of the other books that have been written have been much more on the other side of that ledger in terms of more on the critical side than the positive side. And he asks, are the other books overstating it, or were you making a conscious decision not to focus elsewhere in terms of not talking about the infighting or internal disagreements in the administration? Yeah,
well, Tevi, thanks for participating today. Tevi and I have known each other for a very long time. A couple of things. I do think I'm an inherent optimist. That's the way I've been my whole life. So maybe there's a tinge of optimism beyond objectivity in the book. But Tevi and everyone else who's listening, this is a book that is a tribute to American free enterprise. That's what it is. It's not a political or a politically motivated book. It is to remind Americans that we have a nimble and very dexterous and innovative free market set of companies, when called upon, acted entirely on behalf of the American people. And sometimes I get questions, snarky questions from others. Well, Paul, weren't you concerned that these guys made money in the course of Operation Warp Speed? My first answer is, I hope so. I hope they did. And then my second answer is, but you didn't see them working well beyond the call of duty on behalf of the American people. So I didn't want the politics to, if you will, cloud the major message of the book, which is we live in a great country that has a free enterprise system that delivered more to the American people than any other economic system delivered to its people in the world during a time of crisis. And so that's why I didn't intentionally keep anything out. I just called it as I saw it. And for me and the Operation Warp Speed team, this was like an unbelievable experience. It wasn't a negative experience. And I write in the book, all our interactions with the president, my interactions with him were fantastic. So I would have been, I think, untruthful if you had seen much more controversy than what I already put in the book.
Have you read a bunch of the other accounts of COVID in 2020 and 2021? I mean, I'm assuming you've probably read some of them. Do you find, is there one you'd recommend to the rest of us to read, or do you feel that? I mean, and if the answer is no, that's okay. But just if there's one that you like, I'd love to know so I could make sure I put it on my list.
Yeah, I've read some. I did, as you did, I read Michael Lewis's book. I thought that was a little bit of a love affair with Charity Dean more than anything else, is what I could take out of the book. Which I'm sure she did a spectacular job, but that was written very early. I read Scott Atlas's book, and Scott, in typical Scott fashion, is almost always right but could benefit from a softer communication style. So I think he had a lot of legitimacy, and I spent a lot of time with him when he was there as an advisor to the president, and I thought he was very compelling, but not exactly how to win friends and influence people style, right? I haven't read Deb Burks's book yet, and I haven't read Scott Gottlieb's book, so I need to get to those. But I think they all tell a similar story from a different perspective. So I think at some level, they're all valuable. It's just depending on, where you stand depends on where you sit. And they were all sitting in different roles.
What do you think is the thing that people don't know about President Trump in terms of his role and leadership in the COVID fight that you wish people knew?
Yeah, I refer to him, Avik, as the executive sponsor, and that's a corporate term from my days at McKinsey, where we used to, participate in these major transformations. And what do you expect from a corporate sponsor? Well, you expect them to provide the resources, to provide the air cover, to provide, in many ways, the induced cooperation that is required to get something like this done. But it's also, and the most important thing, and I mean this sincerely, that the president did was what he didn't do. And what he didn't do was micromanage the team. And he knew we had gathered and assembled a group of experts who were the best in the world at what they did. And his interactions with us were always, what can I do to help you more? Never micromanaged whatsoever. Now, when we left, at least what the members of the Operation Warp Speed team who remained there told me, was everything got centralized in the White House. Decision-making got slowed down, got entirely focused on vaccines at the expense of therapeutics, and they didn't let the experts make the decision. So, there's a lot of criticisms of the president out there. Some of them are well-deserved, but when it came to Operation Warp Speed, he was a terrific executive sponsor. And I'll tell you one, there is a little anecdote in the book that's pretty moving, which is every time we went to see him and briefed him on vaccines, he'd say, what about therapeutics? And he would say, listen, I've had 4 of my close friends die of COVID. I think most Americans recognize that vaccines aren't perfect, but if they wind up in a hospital bed, they want to know, is there a cure for this thing? So he was always pushing us faster on therapeutics. And of course, we had a couple come out in the fall, the monoclonal antibodies and remdesivir and a few other things. But if you fast forward a year, when Paxlovid came out from Pfizer, or Molnupiravir came out from Merck and Ridgeback, there were no supplies of it. There was none manufactured. So these were breakthrough therapies. And obviously the Warp Speed team, after we left, weren't investing in therapeutics, but the president pushed us very hard on that. And again, 2020 hindsight, but I think he was right. That's in the long term, the therapeutics is going to be just as important as the vaccines.
Have you been in touch with people in the Biden administration, or have they reached out to you at all to ask for advice or to thank you or anything? What's been your interaction with that?
Not once. And I talk in the book, actually a little bit more serious, is that, I think a lot of your viewers and listeners know what a landing team is. So when administrations change, you have the new team come in and they sit side by side with the existing team so that there's a smooth transition. And we set aside scores of cubicles and conference rooms on the second floor of the Humphrey building, which is the HHS headquarters. And it was directly adjacent to where the vaccine operating center was. So on the second floor of the Humphrey building is where the nerve center, think of it as Houston Mission Control for vaccine distribution and manufacturing, was. And they didn't come in once. They did a bunch of Zooms, but they never came in. And their reason was, well, we're afraid of COVID transmission. And we're like, well, these Army guys who've served, 4 times in Iraq and Afghanistan, and everyone else in HHS did not miss a day from, January 3rd, when we knew about this, until we left office, did not miss a day in the office. So it just didn't send the right signal of, we're your new leaders and we're in the foxhole with you. That wasn't the signal that was sent. Anyway, so yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. On behalf of the hundreds of millions, if not billions of people who benefited from COVID vaccines. I want to thank you for all the hard work that you put in, and all the hard work that all of your colleagues put in. It really was a remarkable effort.
Yeah, no, thanks, Avik. Thanks for having me. And I think just a couple of parting statements. The Army Materiel Command, whom you referred to earlier, these guys have been supporting combat operations in the Middle East for 20 years. They knew precisely what they were doing. And in the book, I talk about the kitting of needles and syringes and everything else. And Gus Perna insisted that each kit would go out with the vaccines that were being shipped. He said, put 10% more needles and syringes in there. Now, who would have ever thought of that? Well, the guy who has been dealing with soldiers for 20 years knows that things, people drop things and they get contaminated, and he didn't want any of the vaccines to expire. So he put 10% more in each, just those little things that they did. And I mentioned Monsef, but he worked for $1. He came out of retirement. Carlo De Natale Stefani had just retired, came back. So this was it was kind of a call to arms. And hopefully the book brings out a number of characters, Bob Cadlick and others, who really left it all on the field. And it's just important, I think, for folks to know that this type of talent and this type of commitment really does exist out there. And once it's motivated, it can do, as the book says, almost the impossible.
What's next for you, Paul?
Oh, I got a lot of irons in the fire. I'm serving on a number of healthcare boards, obviously promoting the book. I have a number of trips coming up for that. I'm still doing some consulting and just waiting and seeing what happens. I'm staying in touch with the healthcare industry. I tell people after 2.5 years in the government, we're at the center of the regulatory world. You lose track of all the amazing innovation that's happening at the front line of the industry. So I've kind of reconnected with that, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I hope you've taken some time off, because you deserve it.
Yeah, thanks, Avik, and thanks again for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. We will post a video of this on YouTube, and we will also convert it to a podcast. So if you subscribe to our podcast, American Wonk, on iTunes or whatever you use to subscribe to podcasts, you can find it there, or you can find it at youtube.com/FREOPP. Thanks again, Paul Mango, for joining us. The book is Operation Warp Speed. You can get it anywhere you buy books, and you definitely should read it if you want to understand what a remarkable achievement it was to get these vaccines in the hands of patients. Thanks again, Paul.
Thanks, Avik.